This is Mission Possible Inclusive Capitalism, the podcast show that fixes economic inequality, economically empowers Main Street, and has a little fun along the way.
Hello, I'm Katherine, and welcome to today's episode. In these podcasts, I'm going to be bringing you some of the most stunning thinkers in capitalism and phenomenal champions of Main Street. And the first has to be Colin MAYER. Try this for size. According to Colin, the idea that the aim of companies is to maximise shareholder value represents a betrayal of one of humanity's most extraordinary inventions. The corporation is not a vehicle for controlling our lives for the benefit of a small class of privileged owners. It is a body that can promote cooperation and collaboration in the realization of purposes that individually we can neither conceive nor achieve with the same degree of integrity nor credibility. Shareholders have obligations and duties and responsibilities to parties that they don't own but have significant impact and effect on. Why trust is such a vital component of business and is a completely unrecognised basic business asset. And lastly, no pressure or anything, but so long as the corporation is viewed as just an instrument of its shareholders, then these problems will become worse and bring us to a point of social, political and environmental catastrophe. But also, what makes the corporation so remarkable is that it equally has the power to do the opposite, to be our saviour and source of social as well as economic well-being, provided that we recognise that our intellectual conception of it is fundamentally wrong and that the separation of its control by management from its ownership by shareholders is its attribute, not its deficiency. Professor MAYER is the former chair of Oxford University's Business School. He's taught at Harvard, Stanford, Columbia and MIT. He's an expert on all aspects of corporate finance, corporate governance, taxation, regulation of financial institutions, and the role of the corporation in contemporary society. He has consulted for numerous large firms and governments around the world. He's held so many prestigious positions and roles that I think it's just easiest to say that he's one of capitalism's most eminent statesmen. What I like most about Colin is that he started out as an engineer. His first degree at Oxford was engineering and economics. And I've noticed that you can always rely on an engineer to get to grips with really unwieldy problems and be enough of a creative thinker to find a way out of the mess. Remember that as you listen to some of Colin's jaw-dropping, scandalous proclamations on capitalism, that his work is considered so phenomenal and dead on the mark that Her Royal Highness Queen Elizabeth made Colin a commander of the British Empire. So he couldn't be more of an establishment figure. Quite frankly, by the way, I think a far more superior title of honour that should be bestowed upon Colin is the rather more delicious, glorious American term of honour, badass. I do have to warn you that some of what you're about to hear is so shocking that you probably ought to be sitting down for this. In fact, some of his content is so incendiary that your ears might burn off. And finally, if you've ever wondered what Sir Laurence Olivier would have sounded like if he had been an economist, this is it. Colin, let's start by touching on the history of the corporation. You point out that it's over 2,000 years old, and throughout its history, it's very much had a social purpose. And later on, the early modern corporation was an instinctively and inherently social entity. Can you give us some examples?
So the corporation was established under Roman law to perform of collecting taxes, minting coins, and looking after public buildings. It then developed into an organization that was associated with the administration of municipalities around Europe. It was in turn associated with the development of universities, and many of the earliest universities were corporations, and indeed the university in which I currently sit, Oxford University, is an early form of corporation. It developed in the Middle Ages around the form of the trade guilds, which in turn took on the elements associated with business partnerships, which were very important, in particular in the Middle East and increasingly in continental Europe in the early part of the last millennium. And as it did so, Then it took on the form of merging into the various trade companies that developed in particular the 15th, 16th century to undertake merchant trading around the world. The best known example of that was the East India Company, but there were many others as well. It subsequently took on a form in which it became a public corporation, in the sense that it was largely chartered by kings and parliament, and in particular it was associated with some of the largest infrastructure projects, for example, the building of the canals and railroads around the world. So until the early middle part of the 19th century, its public function, its social function, was the dominant element in business and the corporation. With freedom of incorporation in the 19th century, it began to take on a form in which the financial performance of it took greater significance than it had previously done. But even so, those early private companies, many of which were associated with the rapidly developing manufacturing industries in the 19th century, were held by families. And those families, first of all, held the companies for several generations. And secondly, they were very much tied into their nations and their local communities. And because of the association of the name of the family with the business, those families were very concerned about their reputation in their communities and their societies. And so, although they were privately incorporated, they still performed a very public function. That was true also through the first half of the 20th century. But what happened in the first half of the 20th century was that many of those family companies became listed on stock markets around the world, in particular in the UK and the United States. And as they were listed on stock markets, they issued shares. And as they issued shares, the ownership by the families began to become diluted, to the point that the families lost control. And as they lost control, they became more exposed to the influence of capital markets. And in particular, what happened was that there was what is termed a separation of ownership and control. Ownership became very dispersed in the hands of multiple individual shareholders and institutional shareholders. And as a consequence of that, those investors, those shareholders, no longer had much authority over the running of the company, unlike the families who used to own their firms. And with that separation of ownership and control, there was a concern about the increasing lack of accountability of management to their shareholders. And that promoted the development of what was a very important introduction of the market for corporate control, takeovers, and in particular hostile takeovers. And those became increasingly important in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. And during this millennium, what we've observed is the introduction, in addition to the takeover market, of what is termed hedge fund activism, by which some institutions, hedge funds, buy blocks of shares in companies, and they take control not through taking over the whole of the company, but just by controlling a substantial block of shares in firms. And those developments of, in particular, the market for corporate control and hedge fund activism has given rise to a steadily rising focus of management and companies on just one objective, namely their financial performance and the shareholder value of their companies. And that is why it's a significant shift from how business was originally conceived, what the corporation was established to do, and what has been the purpose of business for nearly all of its 2,000-year history.
You noted the 3 reasons why societies become entitled to make claims on corporations based on the principle of reciprocity. Corporations rely on society. Can you talk us through this reciprocity?
So the role of business in society is to perform a very important function. The purpose of a business is the reason why it exists, why it's created, what it's there to do, and what it aspires to become. And in particular, the purpose of business is not to produce profits. The purpose of business is to produce profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet. And in the process, it produces profits. But profits are not per se the purpose of business. Everyone who runs successful businesses knows that to be the case. And they don't profit from producing problems for people or planet. Instead, what they do is they commit to their corporate purposes. And they commit to the various parties who help to contribute to those corporate purposes: the employees, the suppliers, the customers and distributors, the societies within which they operate. And those parties in turn commit to those corporate purposes. And that gives rise to reciprocal relations of trust, the reciprocity to which you just referred. That reciprocity is the basis of mutual benefits to both the parties to the firm, its employees, its suppliers, its customers, its societies, and to the firm itself. It gives rise to more engaged employees, more loyal customers, more reliable suppliers, more supportive shareholders and societies. And those in turn give rise to greater revenues, lower costs, and more profits. In other words, to more successful firms financially, as well as in their contributions to society, the environment, and future generations. And that is what I mean by the reciprocity and the reciprocal relations that are key to the success of companies.
When you talk about this principle of reciprocity, isn't this reciprocity already contained sufficiently within the dollar exchange? Workers get paid, suppliers get paid. So why is there any more to this principle than what is already contained within this monetary exchange?
The answer to the question as to why is reciprocity important over and above pure monetary or dollar exchange is that the relations between different parties, between customers and firms, between suppliers and firms, between employees and their owners, are based on much more than just the contracts between those parties. Money exchanges hands on the basis of contractual relations. But contracts are very incomplete. They don't specify all of the relations that are important to the transactions in which we engage. There is a very important additional element over and above those monetary exchanges, and that is trust. In so much of what we do in economies, in societies, within nations and between nations, is based on relations of trust. Trust is one of the most important and yet unrecognized asset of firms, of suppliers, of purchasers, of employees, because in the absence of trust, then many of the relationships and transactions on which it's based simply break down. And that trust depends on the trustworthiness of firms and the parties to the firms to uphold their commitments to each other. So it isn't simply not enough to rely on monetary dollar exchanges. We also have to demonstrate the commitment towards being trustworthy for effective economies, companies, and societies to operate. And those aspects of trustworthiness are in turn based on the values of organizations and institutions. Values of honesty and integrity, and cultures of commitment to their corporate purposes.
What about this privilege of incorporation? You wrote that history demonstrates that social purpose was not incidental to the privilege of incorporation. Instead, it was inseparable from the right to incorporate. Can you explain what is this privilege?
So the privilege of incorporation is the rights that are associated with being an incorporated entity. And those rights are predominantly associated with the rights of the owners. The underlying notion is that ownership of a company is not that different from the ownership of any other form of property. Ownership of a house or a car or a washing machine. Because in all cases, there is a purchase or an investment by a party. In the case of the firm, it's an investment by an owner in allowing the company to purchase the assets that are required to undertake its operation. But that notion of the property right of owners is changing substantially and has changed already. Over the last 50 or 60 years, the nature of the corporation has changed fundamentally from being about ownership of physical assets like plant, machinery, and buildings, what are termed tangible assets, into predominantly intangible assets. So 50 years ago, some 85% of the assets of the S&P 500 index were associated with those tangible assets. Today, nearly 90% of them are associated with intangible assets, things like patents and licenses and brands, and in particular, reputation. And many of those derive not from physical assets in which owners and shareholders have invested, but stakeholders like employees of organizations, their suppliers, the societies in which they operate, the nature and environment on which they depend. And so that property right view that the claims of owners and shareholders derive from the fact that they were the ones that invested in the company, therefore they have the rights to the ownership of those firms, is becoming increasingly inappropriate and irrelevant as the nature of firms is shifting from being physical assets over which shareholders and owners may have property claims to employees, suppliers, distributors, the environment over which owners have no claims. They don't own their employees. They don't own their suppliers. They don't own their societies. On the contrary, they're dependent on them. And they, therefore, owe a duty of responsibility and obligations to those other parties rather than rights over them. And furthermore, not only do they have obligations and responsibilities to them, the extent to which they are dependent on them and have impact on their societies, their employees, their environment is growing appreciably and rapidly during the course of this century. So it is a precise inversion of the traditional view that owners and shareholders have property rights over their firms to the inverse, that they have obligations and duties and responsibilities to parties that they don't own but have significant impact and effect on.
Then in the last 50 years, we saw a big change. One guy in Chicago launched a cult based on nothing more than his own view of economics and capitalism. In other words, there's no legal basis for his claim, as Professor Lynn Stout so wonderfully pointed out. His view asserted that the purpose of a company is to maximize profits. And so successful was this guy and his cult that it's been automatically taken almost to be a natural law of the universe, unquestioned by anyone in business or finance, etc. How on earth did this cult of shareholder primacy become so quickly, so widely, and so thoroughly accepted?
In 1962, Milton Friedman put forward what has come to be known as the Friedman Doctrine, which states that there is one and only one social purpose of business: to increase profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And that's become the basis of all business policy, business practice, and business education around the world. The reason why it gained so much authority was that it was perceived as addressing a number of problems that were emerging around the period at which he was writing at the beginning of the 1960s. Namely, there was an increasing problem of a lack of accountability of management to their owners, as increasing dispersion of ownership of companies listed on stock markets was taking place. And furthermore, management was taking on the guise of activities that were previously associated not with companies, but with governments, for which they therefore did not have a legitimate claim of authority because they were not elected to perform those functions. Instead, it was argued that it was the role of government to play the function of aligning the interests of business with society more generally. And so the notion emerged that the only responsibility that business leaders should see themselves as having was towards their shareholders, not to other parties. And furthermore, what emerged at the same time were various new mechanisms by which that greater accountability of management to their shareholders could be achieved. In particular, there were reforms to systems of reporting and accounting, which made it easier for investors to evaluate the extent to which management was promoting their interests through various forms of financial reporting. There were, in addition, a variety of mechanisms of ensuring that management that was failing to promote the interests of its shareholders were accountable in the sense that they could be subject to penalties through dismissal, through impact on their remuneration, that in large part came from the emergence of external forms of control by investors, in particular through the emergence of a variety of forms of markets for corporate control. And finally, the influence of the Friedman Doctrine was extended by its introduction as the basis of providing business education in the rapidly developing business schools around the world. And that focus on profitability and shareholder interest lent a degree of authenticity and rigorousness to business school education that previously it was lacking when it didn't have the information set, the theories, the data on which to really determine what gave rise to efficiency in corporations and the promotion of more successful businesses. So a drive for greater business efficiency, corporate performance, led to an increasing focus in business education on the relationship between business and their shareholders. And as a result of that, generations of business leaders who've come out of business schools have been educated on the notion that the promotion of shareholder interests and shareholder values is a primary function that they as business leaders need to perform, and anything else is a diversion from their duties to their shareholders. And so there was no doubt in the minds of the emerging business leaders from the 1970s onwards as to what their proper function was, namely to promote shareholder value.
Colin, let's set aside for the moment the issue of what defines ownership and just use the current assumption of ownership being determined by shareholding. So you mentioned that shareholder primacy is still dominant. But I would strongly argue that no, if we were in a shareholder primacy model, then we wouldn't have these problems. So as per John Kay's work, Stephen Davis's work, Bob Monks's work, Jack Bogle's work, and all the rest, the real shareholders are Main Street savers and pension fund beneficiaries, which, as Edward Wolff at the National Bureau of Economic Research has pointed out, 55% of American households are shareholders, directly or indirectly, through their pensions, savings, 401ks, etc. And so isn't the real problem, I would argue, that we're actually in a Wall Street primacy model, not a shareholder primacy model, whereby Wall Street has interjected itself into the naturally aligned partnership of American savers and pension fund beneficiaries who would typically have a long-term time horizon, and corporations which also have a long-term time horizon, i.e. their own longevity. And Wall Street has essentially commandeered the voice and the influence of Main Street shareholders to serve its own self-interested, short-term purpose, in other words, their paychecks and their firm's profit generation. And so if Wall Street were doing its job properly and focusing not on its own needs, but on the needs of Main Street shareholders, whose money they are managing, we wouldn't have this problem that we do today, or at least not to this extreme degree, whereby Wall Street investment managers and sell-side analysts force corporate executives into a short-term focus, which is reliant on cost-cutting driven profit growth instead of top-line, innovation-driven profit growth, which is sustainable long-term growth. And this cost-cutting focus is basically squeezing workers as input costs, failing to invest in workers as productive assets and innovation enablers, and thus innovation-driven productivity growth, thereby ensuring sustained, equitable pay growth and inclusive capitalism. In other words, shouldn't we shift this debate to focus more on Wall Street primacy, not shareholder primacy, in order to rehabilitate capitalism and make it inclusive?
It is certainly correct that institutional investors play a very important role in terms of the objectives of corporations. There are many business leaders who aspire to promoting objectives for their companies that go beyond pure financial performance. But at the end of the day, and this is the way in which business is currently conceived, business leaders are agents of their owners. And indeed, much of the teaching and thinking that has gone on since the Friedman Doctrine was first put forward in the 1960s has been about how to align business leader interests with those of their investors and their shareholders. So however enlightened business leaders are about the objectives of their companies, ultimately, they can only operate in the context of what is perceived as being in the interests of their investors. Now, that comes on then to the critical role that the financial markets perform, and in particular, the investment chain, as it's described, that runs from people who invest in companies, who buy shares in companies, who hold the credit, debt of companies, through the asset owners like the pension funds and life insurance companies, the institutional owners, through the asset managers, the fund managers who manage money for the institutional owners. And ultimately, they in turn invest in companies. So we go from this chain of individual investors through institutional asset owners, through asset managers to companies. And the financial markets have a critical role to play in transforming the interests that you and I have as individual investors in savings, which should be liquid and should be relatively safe, into what companies need to invest in, which are illiquid, long-term, highly risky assets. And that is the function that we need financial markets to perform. And the question is, are they performing that function adequately? Well, many people believe they're doing exactly the opposite. That to the extent that we have an interest in issues other than pure financial returns, and many individual investors are indeed concerned about the environmental impact of companies and the impact that they're having in societies. And many investors are indeed concerned about the long term, if only, for example, in relation to their pension funds. So that there are asset owners that may seek to be investing in companies for the long term, but they're doing so through fund managers that have incentives that are very much focused on the short term, and in particular the short-term financial performance that they are able to produce. And so even if you and I as individual investors or the asset owners have a focus on the long term or performance beyond just financial performance, that gets extinguished through the investment chain by intermediaries, namely the asset managers, who have a predominant focus on financial performance and short-term financial performance. And that in turn gives rise to a focus in companies on short-term financial measures of performance, irrespective of how long-term and enlightened the management of those companies are.
Corporate governance is currently associated with aligning the interests of management and shareholders. Instead, it should be linked to the implementation of corporate purpose, you wrote. Yes, I would agree to the corporate purpose part, but I wouldn't agree with the rest. There are, I would argue, two sets of alignment. Corporate executives' interests are already aligned with Wall Street's interests, in other words, short-term rewards, short-term outcomes. And both corporate executives and Wall Street, and the pay packets of both corporate executives and Wall Street, are determined by short-term outcomes and results. This is at the expense of the natural alignment of interests of the corporation itself, which probably wants to stick around for as long as possible, and with Main Street shareholders, who are typically saving for retirement decades out from now, or college funds, and so need corporates to focus on robust, sustainable, long-term, in other words, top-line, innovation-driven growth for decades to come, i.e. to focus on healthy corporate longevity. So surely corporate governance needs to also focus on mitigating Wall Street primacy.
So let's just start off by being clear about what corporate purpose means. Corporate purpose, as I define it, is the profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and not profiting from producing problems for people or planet. Now, the importance of that definition of purpose is that it provides a focus on a number of elements. First of all, that companies should not do harm, or to the extent that they do harm to others, to people or planet, then they clean up the mess. And they should not deem themselves to be making profits until they've cleaned up the mess that they've created. Secondly, it puts emphasis on the fact that purpose is about making profits. So this is not charity or philanthropy. This is hard-nosed business. But it's not about profit maximization. It's about providing solutions to problems and business identifying ways of solving problems in credible forms to which they can commit and for which they are trustworthy to deliver. And once you think in those terms, then that profoundly changes the nature of business. It doesn't only shift us away from a pure focus on shareholder primacy by emphasizing that the objectives of companies is not to maximize profits, but it also emphasizes the fact that companies are not just there to produce goods and services. That's not their primary function. It's not about stacking them high and selling them cheap. It's about solving the problems that you and I as customers, suppliers, distributors, communities, future generations face, and for which we look to business to provide us with effective means of solving.
I want to talk to you about equating shareholders with corporate ownership. You wrote, the reason why this has happened was that the rights of shareholders were equated with the property rights of owners. Shareholders bore the risks and rewards of the success and failure of business, and so had corresponding rights to control it. And you've pointed out that actually employees bear far greater risk because they can't diversify that risk, unlike shareholders. I also want to cite the work of Professor William Lazanick and Professor John Kay. No, shareholders are not providing capital to corporations. They are providing capital to other people around the casino table, as John Kay said, swapping bits of paper. In other words, the person they're buying the shares from. That money does not go to the company's coffers. As Lazanik pointed out in his downsize and distribute thesis, having crunched the numbers, that actually corporates have in fact been providing capital to shareholders, not vice versa. I also want to cite the unfortunately recently deceased Professor Lynn Stout. She used the analogy of a horse to contextualize residual risk of shareholding. The idea that the shareholder is entitled to what is left over after other entitlements have been met when the company ceases to exist. Her analogy was approximately, someone who is entitled to the dead horse's carcass is not entitled to control the horse whilst it's still running around the field. She also pointed out that the only legal obligation of a corporate director is the business judgment rule, nothing about serving shareholders' interests. So given the above, why has this false notion of shareholders equating as the owners of the corporation stuck so strongly?
The reason why it's prevailed for at least the past 60 years, and do bear in mind that 60 years is a pinprick in the total life and duration of the 2,000-year corporation. So it's simply not correct to say that it's long duration in terms of the total time frame of the firm. But the reason why it has gained so much traction over the last 6 decades or so is that it's a very effective means for ensuring that companies deliver in terms of those for whom it's perceived that they have a right to a claim and return on the company. And once you think in those terms and you begin to confirm the rights of shareholders, you then build up a whole series of vested interests. Vested interest of those who invest in the first place, all of the parties that support them in those investments, namely the institutions and the advisors and the consultants. And in addition, you then align interests of management, so you reward them on the basis of financial performance. And it becomes very lucrative for those who are working in companies. So you build up a whole series of vested interests that it becomes then extremely difficult to reverse without antagonizing a large number of parties simultaneously. And so there is a view that prevails, in particular in the United States, that it is a fundamental right of investors and managers to be rewarded on the basis of the financial performance of firms. And if you do anything else, then you're interfering with that fundamental right of individuals. It's essentially a notion of liberty. And liberty is a very important concept that underpinned what Milton Friedman was talking about, the liberty of people to allocate their property as they saw appropriate, and for there not to be interference with that. And so that notion of liberty is used to reinforce the rights of those various different parties to operate in this way. But actually, that is a misconstruction of any reasonable notion of liberty. Namely, the liberty of individuals derives not only from the existence of there being markets. And the concept of liberty that underpinned Friedman's doctrine was that liberty came from being able to choose where you wanted to be employed, who you wanted to employ, where you wanted to purchase from, who you wanted to sell to, namely those markets in which companies and individuals traded and the competition in those markets. Now, that liberty that comes from competition is only really liberating if the people who trade in those markets or wish to trade in the markets have the ability to do so, namely if they have the resources to do so. And so while it may be true of those with the adequate wealth or the income that derives from companies to be able to exercise that liberty that comes from competition in markets, for many people, the effect is exactly the opposite, that by concentrating wealth and control in the hands of a small number of people, namely the owners and the managers of companies, you're depriving everyone else of liberty because you're not providing them with the capabilities to be able to exercise their choice. So that however effective those markets are in terms of being competitive markets, there is a whole swathe of society that is excluded from being able to reflect that supposed liberty because they don't have the capacity and the capabilities to be able to exercise. If, on the other hand, you view business as being there to solve the problems of people and planet, the very purpose of business then is to be able to confer those capabilities on people who currently are incapable of exercising them by giving them the capacity to be able to exercise their free will within those markets.
Let's talk about purpose. You advocate for companies needing to articulate purpose. I have some issues with this. Number one, purpose can mean anything and therefore nothing. Number two, companies would say that they already have a purpose, to maximize profits and keep Wall Street happy. Number three, a tobacco company might say, well, our purpose is to flog as many cigarettes as possible. Number four, purpose will just be another advertising tagline. Number five, who is adjudicating what qualifies as an appropriate purpose? And number six, to borrow from Professor Jill Fisher's critique at the Columbia Law School event, whose input should determine this corporate purpose, and who reconciles the conflicting inputs and prioritizes amongst these?
So purpose, as I defined it in terms of producing profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and not profiting from producing problems for people or planet, is not vague. It's very clear and precise as to what companies should seek to do and what they should not seek to do. The extent to which and the way in which it should be enforced and imposed is dependent on the way in which companies operate. So let's start off with the second part of that statement, that companies should do no harm. They shouldn't profit from producing problems for people or planet. Now, the basis on which that should be ascertained is in terms of the criteria by which we judge the impact that companies are having on society, on the environment, and on future generations. And let me take the example of tobacco companies, which are producing goods that cause massive damage to millions of people around the world. The nature of their product is one in which there is a fundamental violation of a principle of purpose, and the extent to which that is giving rise to profits beyond what are true profits of firms, essentially fake profits because they do not account for the cost of cleaning up the mess, is something for which one can provide a method of measuring. So it's perfectly feasible to establish the extent to which the overall effect of the harm that's being caused gives rise to a diminution or even an elimination of the profits associated with such companies. And in essence, what that is pointing to is the notion that there are companies that are producing goods where once one thinks about the real purpose of firms, the extent to which they are contributing or on the contrary to which they are causing detriment, then one recognizes that in many cases they do not have a legitimate reason for their operations, and that at the very least they need to shift the nature of their operations very rapidly. And likewise, if you think in terms of, for example, confectionery companies that originally were established on the basis of very, very justifiable reasons. For example, chocolate manufacturers were deemed to be producing products that were not only desirable to customers, but in many cases were substituting for other products that were less desirable and more harmful to consumers than chocolate. But over time, we've come to recognize the harmful elements of those products in terms of their impact on obesity and diabetes, etc. And again, there's a shift in the way in which those companies are viewing their activities. But the main difficulty that arises is the speed with which those changes occur. And so long as companies do not realize that their purposes are not to produce profits but to produce solutions and to avoid harm, then the speed at which they, as it's sometimes termed, go on the journey of transforming their businesses is simply too slow. And what is needed is for companies, first of all, to recognize the failure to define their purposes and objectives appropriately. And once they recognize their objectives as being to do no harm and to shift out of products that are producing harm into others that are not doing that, then that gives rise to a completely different mindset in which the notion of, well, we're doing what we can to move into these other products is not good enough in terms of providing the solutions that societies and the environment require. And the same goes in particular in relation to thinking about the damage that companies are doing to the environment and to our natural capital. That business simply needs to recognize that the notion that it's okay to make profits and to recognize a need to change, and one can do so over an extended period of time, the need to recognize that that is no longer acceptable is becoming increasingly urgent, both in terms of the health of society, in terms of the health of our environment, and indeed in terms of the ability of us as nations and humanity to survive.
So you're advocating for The purpose of corporations is not to produce profits. The purpose of corporations is to produce profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet. In the process, it produces profits, but profits are not per se the purpose of corporations. This aligns very well with our stateside gurus. First of all, Pete Drucker's, the purpose of a business is to create a customer and to keep a customer. And Harvard Business School's Mike Porter's Creating Shared Value initiative, Mike wrote, the purpose of the corporation must be redefined as creating shared value, not just profits per se. This will drive the next wave of innovation and productivity growth in the global economy. Shared value is not social responsibility, philanthropy, nor sustainability, but a new way for companies to achieve economic success. So it seems that you're in good company, but does your definition of purpose encompass and address the issue of productivity growth that we have here in the American and indeed the British economies today?
Yes, the purposeful company addresses productivity as a central issue. And the reason for that is that what a purposeful company is seeking to do is to achieve a clear objective through engaging the various parties that are necessary for its attainment. Key to that is the role of employees, and what a purposeful company does is to provide employees with the capabilities and the capacity to be able to contribute to the delivery of the firm's purpose. That involves investing in human capital, training and education that is a key part of the delivery of the company's purpose. And in so doing, what the company is focusing on is the relation it's got with its employees and the promotion of fulfilling, meaningful, purposeful work for its employees that they can really engage with and feel some sense of commitment and obligation to. So that notion of creating a reciprocal benefit for employees as well as the firm is something that motivates people and excites them in terms of a sense that they're really creating something of significance. And that is a key component in terms of the fulfillment of the purpose and the enhancement of the productivity of the firm.
Let's talk about trust. You wrote, well-founded trust and trustworthiness are valuable. They promote the social efficiency of capitalism, decrease its risks, allow for respect, validate reciprocity, and safeguard dignity. But why are you talking about trust? Is it an issue? To what extent is corporate America untrustworthy?
Trust is one, if not the most important assets of firms. The reason why trust is so important is that the trustworthiness of an organization is the basis on which it establishes relationships with other parties. It's the ability of a company to be able to demonstrate commitment to other regarding interests, not just to the self-interest of those who own the company or run the company, but other regarding in taking account of and promoting the interests of those other parties. And the reason why trust is so important is that at present what we do is we rely on contracts as ways of thinking about how we bind other parties to ourselves. And that is simply not a sufficient mechanism for ensuring that one has commitment. In many cases, the role that the firm is playing is in terms of balancing the interests of different parties, balancing the interest of customers and suppliers. Now, what undermines that element of trust is if it gets unbalanced. If any particular party becomes so dominant that the interest of the firm is solely aligned with that party's perspective, what then happens is that those interests are pursued at the expense of other parties. And that then jeopardizes that key asset of trust. And to the extent that there is this drive for shareholder primacy in the US and in the UK, it has diminished the extent to which institutions and companies have been able to build up effective relations of trust with other parties. And that in turn undermines not only the role of companies in society, but the performance of the firms and institutions themselves.
Can you really trust corporations to properly understand what trust and trustworthiness are? That it's not about glossy advertising and entitlement, feeling entitled to being trusted, but rather acting in a way that is trustworthy, that earns trust. As psychologists say, trust is earned, not demanded. And if anyone ever says to you, trust me, run fast. And by the way, you won't find a single company that doesn't believe it to be entirely trustworthy. Just try talking to Wall Street, for example. And for that matter, try finding anyone who doesn't think that they're trustworthy. We all believe that we're trustworthy. In other words, how do you have a meaningful conversation about trust and trustworthiness when it comes to corporations? Aren't you just creating a boon for advertising companies to juice up and flog some very expensive trust us marketing campaigns?
The way in which successful companies really establish their trustworthy credentials is through the forms of ownership and governance, measurement and incentives within the organization. And what they do is they provide a real alignment between the interests of parties with which the firm is engaging and the way in which the incentives and governance of the firm operates. And I want to illustrate that in relation to banking. And it's a sector in which, in many respects, levels of trust over the last decade or so have been lower than in nearly any other part of the economy, in particular in the developed economies of North America and of Europe. And I'm going to take an example of a bank that has been one of the most successful banks in Europe in terms of its financial performance for its investors, but also in terms of the degree of trust that it's established with its customers and its employees. And that's illustrated by the fact that it regularly has the most satisfied customers of any of its competitors, and in turn has some of the most loyal customers of any bank. It's one of the fastest growing banks in the UK, but it's not British Bank, it's the Swedish bank Handelsbanken. And the way in which it's established those relations of trust is through its values and its governance, its methods of measuring its performance, and its ownership structure has facilitated all of those. And what it's done is to establish, first of all, values which are those of a humane bank which has a real interest in the well-being of its employees and in the satisfaction of its customers. The way in which it's done that is essentially to create a traditional type of local bank in the context of a major multinational bank. And the way in which it's succeeded in doing that is through delegation of decision. The normal way in which a bank operates is a very hierarchical form in which significant decisions have to be moved up the hierarchy for agreement by senior management. But what Handelsbanken has done is exactly the opposite. It has empowered people at the local branch level, and in particular the branch managers. The mantra of the bank is the branch is the bank. And it's empowered the branch manager to take decisions over virtually everything, from which customers they service, what products they sell them, price at which they charge those products, etc. And that has allowed the branch to build up true relations with its customers that do not involve the branch manager having to say to the customer, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, I'll have to refer this up to someone for authorization, wait 3 weeks and then respond by saying, I'm terribly sorry, they've told me that I cannot accept your request." They can make a decision based on their belief about the desirability of that form of custom. And that relation of trust between the branch manager and the customer in turn reflects the trust that the senior management places in the branch manager. The reason why they're able to delegate that is, what they do is they place a lot of emphasis on selecting the right people as branch managers, and then they instill the values of the bank very carefully in the minds of those who are operating in the branches, and then they let them get on and run their branches without continuous monitoring and supervision. And so it's that type of consideration about values, governance, what's measured, that allows some organizations to establish a real degree of trustworthiness that customers then appreciate. And as I just described, it gives rise to reciprocal relations. The customers respond to the trustworthiness by being more loyal to the bank, and that greater loyalty creates more financial benefit and financial returns and security for the bank in turn.
Is a business with a CEO to average worker pay differential of, say, over 100 untrustworthy, but a business with a ratio below 100 trustworthy? Is a business with a CEO like Jamie Dimon, who couldn't figure out how one of his lowest paid workers could budget her paltry salary given the local market dynamics, rents, etc., as per California Congresswoman Katie Porter's grilling? Could you say that a company like Walmart, with a significant proportion of its full-time workers paid so little that they're also food stamp recipients? In other words, taxpayers are funding Walmart's profits. Might you say that that perhaps makes Walmart and such companies untrustworthy? Do you say that an American company that tax dodges by putting its domicile in favourable overseas locations untrustworthy? Is a company that cuts more jobs than it creates trustworthy or untrustworthy? Is a company that uses automation just to cut worker costs and doesn't reinvest those savings into training and upskilling its workers trustworthy, untrustworthy? What about Larry Fink, who advocates every year for corporate purpose, but whose active equity investment managers meet with CEOs every day and push them into further cost cutting just to meet next quarter's earnings? That means squeezing workers' pay more and more, and the cycle goes on. Is BlackRock trustworthy? In other words, how do you measure or meaningfully assess, rate, rank trustworthiness?
The observation about companies that pay their employees low salaries which they can't afford to live on, that avoid paying taxes, that lay people off without thinking about the consequences of doing that, that create significant environmental damage in the process of their operations and don't clean up the mess, are all indicative of a fundamental problem with a system that has been designed around the interest of only one party, and that is its shareholders. By promoting the notion of shareholder primacy, in effect, what our systems are doing is to encourage that type of behavior, which looks to minimizing costs, maximizing profits at the expense of other parties. And that does, understandably, create a very strong sense of these institutions are inherently not trustworthy. They are justifiably very close to, if not at the bottom of the ranking of different professions of their trustworthiness, perceived trustworthiness in society. And so the notion behind reconceptualizing business away from a pure focus on shareholder primacy towards a form in which companies regard it as their intrinsic purpose to promote the interests of not just their shareholders, but also the various parties to the firm, including their employees, including their societies, including the future generations, transforms the nature of business in the societies in which we operate, transforms them in the direction in which they are perceived to be servicing those needs of society, of nature, of future generations. And so an inherent implication of that reconfiguration is to create trust and a trustworthiness that currently doesn't exist. And the benefits of so doing are immense for all of us.
You talk about the role of public policy and regulatory changes in restoring capitalism to its truer, better path. But here in the US, where we live in a corpocracy, not a democracy, and by the way, I'm referencing Bob A.G. Monks's book here, Citizens Disunited, and I'm also referencing Professor Gillins's work, which has shown that public opinion has almost zero impact on shaping public policy, for example. Surely looking for such a change, therefore, is just wishful thinking.
No, not at all. There is an increasing realization throughout the world, in the United States as much as anywhere else, that our existing system is failing. It's failing us as societies, as individuals, as the next generation, as nature, and that something needs to change. And the fact that there is and has been such a remarkable shift in attitude over indeed the last few months, let alone the last few years, is indicative of the fact that we as customers, as employees, as societies can really affect change.
Colin, do you think that there is a role for a public advocate to advocate for Main Street's stake in capitalism?
Yes, Main Street should be at the forefront of this reform. And indeed, in many respects, Main Street is committed to doing this and wishes to see it happen. And there are many highly enlightened business leaders who want to have it happen. The problem that in many cases they face is what they see as insuperable problems with actually implementing these ideas, because ultimately they are and they feel themselves to be dependent on and answerable to their institutional masters, and that the capital markets determine the effective direction in which they can lead their organizations. So it's not so much a problem of an absence of voice and opinion within the corporate world as it is in the institutional investment world. It's not so much a Main Street as a Wall Street issue. And thinking about who are really going to be the advocates of doing this in the institutional world and who's going to take a lead in making it happen as part of the investment process and the investment chain is really the missing link that exists at present.
So there you have it. I'm sorry, I know it was a bit cheesy, but I couldn't resist bringing that last one on Colin. In other words, it takes someone who has been at the heart of the Wall Street institutional public equity investment management function to really understand that, number one, the key drivers of publicly listed corporations adopting a relentless, short-term, unsustainable profit growth, cost-cutting, or what I call middle-line focused corporate strategies, which in turn is the key driver of economic inequality, companies using automation and globalization not to help but to hurt workers, and just-in-time labour management and other cost-squeezing practices to continually cut labour costs as much as possible. The key drivers of all this nonsense are the Wall Street investment managers who meet every day with CEOs, etc., of publicly listed corporations. And number two, that the real agency problem that Wall Street investment managers love to talk about so much, which is when the agents or managers act in their own interests instead of the best interests of the owners of those assets. The real agency problem is not between company managers and shareholders, but rather between Wall Street, who is merely managing Main Street's money, and Main Street, who are the true asset owners, shareholders. And number three, where Main Street's voice as shareholders is being hijacked by Wall Street, and thus corporate America is being run for the benefit of Wall Street instead of Main Street. Remember, before I grew up intellectually, so to speak, and started exercising the independence of thought that allowed me to look critically at and intellectually challenge this immense and immensely powerful edifice, this Vatican of male economic power around me, and thereby intellectually outgrew it, before this, I used to be an institutional investor at the heart of Wall Street, responsible for managing about $1 billion of pension fund assets for the three largest Wall Street investment management firms. So I know precisely how this whole model, this industry works. And it is only someone who intimately understands this industry and its shenanigans who can, well, rein in this wild horse gone psycho. And I'm putting this into your hands to execute if you wish to, because I can't do this alone. So, the question is, are you saddling up with me or are you chickening out? Because remember, it's your capitalism. If you don't like it, then change it. Stop waiting for Wall Street to hand you back your economic power and voice. It ain't happening. Or as the Aussies say, stop whinging like a bloody pom and do something about it. If you want to do something about it, come to our website, yourcapitalism.com, get your tweets on, spin some funny memes, and sign our petitions. By the way, I completely forgot to mention Colin's book, Prosperity, Better Business for the Greater Good. I really strongly recommend it for lots of reasons. It's a brilliant book that really takes apart capitalism by taking apart the corporation. But it's also really funny because Colin has a very irreverent sense of humour which keeps popping out. And he's also a very fine wordsmith. I'd also really strongly recommend this link, which was Colin giving his keynote at the Columbia Law School event on economic inequality. Here is the link. It is livestream.com/Columbia Law /Milstein Center 2019 /videos /188144165. And whilst you're there, by the way, you should definitely check out Leo Strine's speech as well, which is phenomenal, jaw-dropping, and very rock and roll. So that's it for now. Thank you very much for stopping by. See you soon.